She found out the locks had been changed the same way she found out most painful things in her life, quietly, without ceremony, with no one there to help her understand what was happening. She was still wearing her funeral dress when she tried the key. Still had cemetery mud on the heels of her good black shoes and Harold's funeral program folded in her coat pocket because she had not been able to bring herself to set it down anywhere. The key she had carried on her ring for 43 years went into the lock on the front door of the house she and Harold had built together and turned without catching, turning freely through nothing, the way a key turns when it belongs to a lock that has been replaced. Elna Calloway stood on the porch of her own home at 73 years old, on the afternoon of her husband's burial, and understood all at once what had happened while she was standing at the graveside. While she had been watching Harold's casket lowered into the cold November earth of Garland County, Indiana, while she had been holding the folded flag and shaking the hands of people whose faces she could not hold on to anymore, someone had been here. Someone had come to this house with a locksmith and a decision already made, and they had not waited for her to get home first. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She did not knock. She stood on the porch for a long moment, long enough for the cold to work through the wool of her coat, and she looked at the door she had painted herself 3 years ago in the particular shade of green Harold had liked, the one she had mixed at the hardware store by holding a maple leaf from their backyard up to the color samples until she found the one that matched. Then she walked back to her car and sat in the driveway of the home she had shared with her husband for 43 years and held the steering wheel with both hands and allowed herself exactly 4 minutes to feel what she was feeling before she decided what to do next. This was who Elna Calloway was. Not a woman who collapsed into crisis, but not a woman who pretended crisis away either. She was a woman who allowed herself the necessary amount of feeling, put it somewhere she could return to later when she had more room for it, and got on with what needed doing. Harold had loved this about her. He had called it her 4-minute rule after the 3rd time he watched her do it after a car accident that wasn't her fault, after the miscarriage that had been the end of their hoping for children of their own. 4 minutes, he had said once, watching her from across a hospital waiting room. You give yourself 4 minutes and then you get up. I've never seen anything like it. She had loved Harold Calloway for 43 years, from the spring afternoon a mutual friend introduced them at a church potluck in Marsden, Indiana, through every season of a life that had been neither easy nor particularly lucky but had been real and warm and completely theirs. He had been 51 and she 49 at their wedding, both of them old enough to understand what they were choosing and young enough still to be astonished that they had found it. They had married in the small white church on Delaware Road on a Saturday in June, with Harold's 2 adult children, Dennis and Renata, present in the 3rd row, watching with the careful, controlled expressions of people who have rehearsed their feelings beforehand and are committed to maintaining them regardless of what they actually feel. Dennis had been 27 at the time of the wedding, already working in commercial real estate in Indianapolis, already carrying the easy confidence of a man who has been told often enough that he is capable that he has stopped questioning it. Renata had been 24, recently married herself to a man named Gregory Pierce who worked in insurance and had the particular quality of presence that makes a person difficult to remember clearly even after meeting them several times. Both of Harold's children had been polite to Elna in the years that followed in the specific way that adult children can be polite to a step-parent they have decided to tolerate without accepting. Polite at dinners. Polite at holidays. Polite in the careful, surface-level way that never quite becomes warmth and has no intention of ever getting there. Harold had understood this. He had talked about it with Elna in the quiet evenings after dinner that were the best part of their days together, sitting on the back porch with tea, the Indiana fields going dark around them. He said he didn't know how to fix it. He said he had tried and continued to try and believed that in time things would change. They had been married for 12 years before he stopped believing that quite as firmly, though he never said so directly. Elna had known anyway. She had watched the dinners and the holidays and the careful polite surfaces long enough to understand that Dennis and Renata had made a decision about her very early and had simply never found reason to revisit it. What she had not known, what she had not suspected until the morning of the will reading, was how far that decision extended. Harold had been diagnosed with the heart condition in March of that year, a valve problem, manageable but serious, the kind of thing that changes the texture of daily life without necessarily shortening it dramatically. He had handled the diagnosis the way he handled most difficult things, with a methodical calm that Elna had always found both reassuring and slightly heartbreaking, because she knew it cost him more than it appeared to. He had reduced his hours at the small engineering consultancy where he had worked since retiring from full-time practice 12 years earlier. He had started going to bed earlier and rising later and saying yes more often to things he would previously have considered indulgent. He had held Elna's hand more. Not as a departure from their established habit, they had always held hands, but with a quality of intention that was new, and that Elna felt and understood and did not speak about directly because Harold was not speaking about it directly, and she had always taken her cues from him in things like this. He died on a Wednesday morning in late October. Unexpectedly in the end, despite the expectation that had lived in the background of every day since March. A second cardiac event, more severe than the first. He had been in the kitchen making coffee when it happened. He was gone before the ambulance arrived. Elna had held his hand on the kitchen floor while she waited, the same hand she had held every day for 43 years, and she had talked to him the way you talk to someone when you are not ready to stop, when the silence of not talking to them is more than you can immediately bear. Dennis and Renata arrived at the house within 2 hours of the hospital call. They were efficient and organized and moved through the rooms with the purposeful energy of people who had been thinking about this moment for longer than Elna had realized. Dennis made phone calls. Renata organized paperwork. They spoke to each other in the shorthand of siblings who share an agenda, and they spoke to Elna in the careful, surface-level way they always had, with an added layer of something that presented itself as concern but had the texture, underneath, of management. She let most of it pass without comment. She was 73 years old and her husband was dead, and she did not have the energy to interrogate the motives of people who were moving through her kitchen with purpose when she herself could barely stand. The funeral was largely arranged by Dennis, who had opinions about the venue and the service and the reception that he presented not as preferences but as decisions, in the tone of a man accustomed to deciding things without consulting everyone affected by those decisions. Elna let most of it go because fighting over flower arrangements with a man who had never once asked her whether the house they were standing in felt like home to her seemed like a waste of the particular energy she still had. She had stood at the graveside with Harold's program in her pocket and his flag in her hands and thought about what 43 years of a life looks like when it is over, how strange it is that so much of it could fit inside a Tuesday through Saturday of arrangements and phone calls and people pressing her hands and saying his name as though saying it enough times would keep it from meaning something final. Then she had driven home. And found that the locks had been changed. The will reading was scheduled for the Monday following the funeral at the office of Harold's attorney, a man named Richard Chalk who had handled Harold's legal affairs for 20 years and who carried the careful neutral expression of someone who has delivered difficult news in enough different ways to have concluded that the most direct way is usually the least cruel. He had called Elna himself the morning after Harold's death and spoken to her for 20 minutes in a voice she had found genuinely kind, which surprised her, because kindness in the middle of official processes was not something she had learned to expect. Dennis and Renata arrived at Chalk's office together, dressed for business, both carrying folders. They sat on one side of the conference table and Elna sat on the other, alone, with her hands folded in her lap and her coat still on because the office was cold and she had not thought to bring a heavier sweater. Her small dog, a 12-year-old beagle named Pearl who had been Harold's more than hers originally but had become equally theirs over a decade of evening walks and Sunday mornings, sat in her car in the parking garage below. She had not wanted to leave Pearl at home. The house no longer felt like home. Richard Chalk began with the marital property. The house on Delaware Road, he read, along with its contents, the vehicle registered to Harold Calloway, and the primary checking and savings accounts, were to be distributed as follows: a 1/3 share each to Dennis Calloway and Renata Calloway Pierce, and a 1/3 share to Elna Calloway, with the provision that Elna's share of the house be satisfied by a cash payment equivalent to her ownership portion, calculated at current assessed value and disbursed within 90 days. Elna absorbed this. She understood what she was being told. Dennis and Renata together controlled 2/3 of the primary marital assets. If they chose to sell the house and she understood her share would be a cash payment, she had no ability to negotiate. She would be out of her home within 90 days. She felt Dennis lean back slightly in his chair. Not quite a smile, but something in his posture that communicated satisfaction, and she kept her eyes on Richard Chalk because she could not look at Dennis Calloway in that moment without showing him something she was not ready to show. Then Chalk cleared his throat and continued. To my wife, Elna Calloway, he read, the property known as the Calloway family farm, recorded in Garland County Land Records under parcel number 14-077-004, consisting of the farmhouse, all outbuildings, all structures, and contents therein, and the 41 acres on which they stand, situated at 9, Barrow Creek Road, Garland County, Indiana. This property is left to Elna in its entirety, without condition or restriction. Renata made a small sound that she covered quickly with her hand. Dennis's expression shifted in a way that was difficult to read, something that crossed between surprise and dismissal before settling decisively on the dismissal side. The Calloway farm, he said, addressing Chalk rather than Elna. Nobody has been out there in 15 years. At least, Chalk said, without inflection. Renata leaned toward her brother and said something low that Elna did not catch. Dennis nodded with the brevity of a man confirming something he has already concluded. Then he looked at Elna for the first time since the reading began. That place is falling apart, he said. Dad drove out there maybe twice in the last decade that I know of. The farmhouse hasn't been occupied since my grandfather died. It might not even be structurally sound at this point. He paused, and his voice took on the quality of what he perhaps intended as generosity. We're not going to hold you to the 90 days on the house payment. You can take your time sorting out your living arrangements. There's no rush. Elna looked at him steadily. She thought about the lock on her front door. She thought about the 4-minute rule and the fact that she had already used her 4 minutes and did not have another available right now. Thank you, she said. That's kind. She signed the documents Richard Chalk had prepared, took the envelope containing the deed to the Calloway farm, thanked him, and walked out into the gray November morning. She sat in the parking garage with Pearl in her lap for a while. Pearl was 12 and moved slowly and had the particular quality of old dogs of seeming to understand when something significant has happened without needing it explained. He pressed his gray muzzle against her hand and she held him and thought about Harold. Harold had not been a man who made careless decisions. He had been an engineer by training and by temperament, someone who reasoned through problems methodically before committing to a course of action. The will had been structured this way deliberately. She understood that. She understood that the arrangement with the house left Dennis and Renata free to sell while ensuring Elna received a cash payment she could live on, at least temporarily. He had not left her homeless. What she did not yet understand was why he had given her the farm specifically. Not a cash account. Not the investment portfolio that surely existed somewhere in his financial life. The farm. 41 acres of Garland County land with a farmhouse nobody had lived in since Harold's father Edmund Calloway died in 1987, and outbuildings that had been sitting untouched through more Indiana winters than Elna had been married to the man who left them to her. She took the deed envelope out of her bag and opened it. The deed was there, formal and legal, the land survey, the parcel number, the property boundaries described in the careful language of official documents. She was about to close the envelope when she noticed something else inside, tucked behind the deed, thin and folded twice. A single sheet of paper in Harold's handwriting. She had not expected it. She sat with it in her hands for a moment before she could bring herself to unfold it. Harold's handwriting was precise and angular, the handwriting of a man who had spent decades drawing engineering specifications, who wrote the way he thought, clearly and without wasted motion. It said, Elna. I am sorry I didn't tell you this sooner. I think I was afraid of getting it wrong, of saying it badly, and so I kept waiting for the right moment and ran out of time the way people always do. My father told me about the room beneath the barn floor the night before he died. He said his own father had built it during hard years and that the family had used it when they needed to and that he had sealed it back when things improved and never opened it again, Because he didn't know how to account for what was inside without raising questions he wasn't prepared to answer. He said he had always meant to handle it properly and never did, and he asked me to do what he couldn't. I drove out to the farm 3 times over the years trying to locate the entrance myself and never could find it. But I believe it's there. Dad wasn't a man who invented things. The entrance, he told me, is in the floor of the barn beneath the feed storage boards along the north wall. There will be a ring bolt set into the planking, though it may be buried under years of dust and time. Go carefully, Elle. Take help if you need it. Whatever is there belongs to you. I left you the farm because you are the only person I have ever known who looks at broken things and sees what they still have in them. I love you. I always will. Harold. Elna read it twice. Then she folded it carefully along its original creases and held it in both hands the way you hold something you are not ready to put down. Outside the parking garage, the gray November air moved through the city with the smell of cold pavement and coming rain. Pearl shifted in her lap and made a sound that was not quite a sigh. She looked at the deed and the letter together in her hands and thought about Harold, about the engineer's mind that could not leave a problem unsolved and had apparently spent the years of their marriage quietly carrying the weight of one he hadn't known how to hand her directly. She thought about his father Edmund, a farmer who had lived through the Depression and the war and who had made decisions about family wealth in the secretive and practical way of men who had learned not to trust institutions with what they had worked to keep. She thought about Dennis saying the farm was falling apart. She started the car. The drive to Barrow Creek Road took just under an hour from Chalk's office in Marsden south on the county highway, then on to routes she did not know well but had visited enough times in the early years of their marriage to remember the general shape of the land. Harold had brought her out to the farm once in their second year together, a Sunday drive in autumn, to show her where he had grown up before his family moved to town when he was 12. She remembered standing at the edge of the property and looking at the farmhouse, already empty then, already beginning its long decline, and thinking that it had good bones. She remembered Harold putting his arm around her shoulders and saying nothing, just looking at the place he had come from, and she had understood without being told that it was complicated for him, that the farm held things he wasn't ready to sort through and she had not pressed. That had been 40 years ago. The county road turned to gravel 2 miles before the property, rough with neglect, ruts worn deep by years of water with nobody coming through frequently enough to grade it smooth. She drove slowly. Pearl sat up in the passenger seat and looked out at the flat fields going by, brown and bare in the November light, the stubble of last summer's crop still standing in rows that faded into a gray sky. The mailbox post at the entrance to the property was still in the ground but snapped off at the base, the box itself lost somewhere in the long grass at the edge of the drive. The drive itself was overgrown but visible, 2 ruts leading back through a stand of old oak and sycamore toward where the farmhouse sat. Elna pulled in slowly and stopped when the house came into full view. She sat in the car and looked at it for a long moment. It was still standing. That was the first thing she registered, and it was not a small thing. After 15+ years of vacancy, through Indiana winters that were no gentle business, it was still standing. The porch on the south side had collapsed and lay in a rotted heap against the front of the house, but the main structure, 2 stories of old-growth timber framing with a brick chimney at its center, was upright and seemingly intact. Windows were dark, several broken, a few still holding glass and frames gone gray with weathering. The roof showed patches of exposed decking where shingles had been lost to wind, but no obvious structural failure. It was damaged the way things are damaged when they are left alone for a long time. Not ruined. Just forgotten. Beyond the house, set back into the north, the barn. Larger than she remembered, or perhaps just more visible now that the trees around it had thinned with neglect. Old timber, weathered nearly black, its walls square and true in a way that spoke to solid original construction. The barn doors on the south face had blown open and one hung crooked from its upper hinge, but the walls were standing and the roofline from where she sat appeared intact. Pearl made a small sound. Elna opened the car door and stepped out into the cold November air. She stood at the edge of what had once been the yard, Pearl moving carefully beside her on his leash, and she looked at the farmhouse and the barn and the 41 acres of Garland County land that Harold had left her, that Harold's father had never properly resolved, that Harold's grandfather had worked with his own hands, that had been sealed and silent for longer than anyone currently living had reason to visit it. She held Harold's letter folded in her coat pocket and felt the weight of everything it contained. There was a room beneath that barn floor. A room that had been sealed for decades, sealed since Edmund Calloway had decided in some year she did not yet know to close it up and leave it for later, and later had never come for Edmund, and it had not come for Harold either, and now it was hers to find. She walked toward the barn first. She was not ready to go into the farmhouse yet. But she was ready to look at the barn from outside, to understand its dimensions, to begin the process of knowing what she was working with. The barn doors were heavy and swollen with years of moisture but yielded when she lifted and pushed in the way barn doors do when you know the trick of them. The interior smell came out to meet her first: hay and old earth and something dry and close beneath both, the particular smell of a space that has been sealed from fresh air for a long time. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. The main floor was hard-packed earth, swept clear at some point in the not-too-distant past, or perhaps simply never heavily used to begin with. Along the north wall, exactly as Harold's letter had described, a raised platform of heavy timber planking ran the width of the barn at a height of perhaps 4 inches off the ground. Feed storage boards. Old ones, their surfaces dark and smooth from decades of use and the weight of things stacked on them. She stood in the middle of the barn and looked at those boards and held Harold's letter in her coat pocket and breathed the cold still air of the sealed space and thought about all the years they had been married while this was here, waiting, and Harold had been carrying this alone, trying to find the right moment to hand it to her. She was going to find what was under those boards. She was going to go carefully, the way Harold had asked. She was going to take the time to understand what she had been given before she did anything else. But first she needed somewhere to sleep. She walked back out into the November gray and looked at the farmhouse the way she had always looked at damaged things, not at what was broken, but at what was still there. The walls on the west and north faces were structurally intact. The chimney was standing. The staircase would need to be tested before trusting, but the framing on the house's undamaged half looked solid from outside. There was quite a lot still there. She went to get her bags from the car. The first night was the hardest, not because of the cold, though the cold was serious and the farmhouse had no working heat source beyond the fireplace in the main room, which she was not yet certain was safe to use, but because the silence was the wrong kind. She had lived for 43 years beside a man whose presence filled a space even when he was quiet. Harold had that quality, a density of being that rooms seemed to hold even after he had left them. The farmhouse on Barrow Creek Road had been empty for decades and it felt like it, the silence inside it not peaceful but accumulated, the silence of a place that had been waiting without knowing what it was waiting for. She had brought blankets from the car, and a battery lantern she kept in the trunk out of habit from a winter years ago when they had lost power for 4 days. She found the least damaged ground floor room, a small sitting room off the main hall on the west side of the house, its walls intact, its single window still holding glass though the frame had swelled and would not open, and she set up the camping cot she had bought that afternoon from the hardware store in Marsden before driving out. She had also bought a broom, a box of kitchen matches, dry fire starter, a small camp stove, soup in cans, crackers, and 3 gallons of water. She had done this methodically, without drama, moving through the hardware store and then the grocery with the focused practicality of a woman who has determined what she needs and is not interested in being delayed by feelings she can address later. Pearl slept pressed against her side on the cot, his warm weight a comfort she did not try to put language to. She lay in the dark with her eyes open and thought about Harold. She thought about the way he had driven out here 3 times over the years trying to find what his father had told him about. She could see it precisely, Harold in his practical way, with his measuring mind, walking the barn floor, looking for the ring bolt his father had described. She thought about what it would have cost him not to find it. Harold had not been a man who failed to solve things he had committed to solving. He would have carried that like a weight, the problem he had inherited and been unable to fully close. And he had carried it without telling her, because Harold was also a man who did not hand people worries he believed he could eventually resolve himself. She thought about Dennis changing the locks on the day of the funeral. She had turned this over during the drive out and continued to turn it now. It was not illegal. She understood that. With the will's terms as they were, Dennis and Renata together controlled a majority share of the house and had every legal right to secure it. What it was deliberate. They had known what the will contained before the reading. They had known, or someone had told them, possibly through Chalk's office in a communication Elna was not privy to, what the terms would be, and they had acted on that knowledge on the day of the funeral rather than the day after, because the day of the funeral was the day Elna would be least capable of responding clearly. That calculation told her something she needed to know. She was not going to be given time to figure things out quietly. Dennis Calloway was going to move efficiently and assume that efficiency would be sufficient. He had always operated this way. She had watched it across 12 years of holidays and dinners. He was a man of commercial real estate, a world that rewarded speed and decisiveness and the ability to act before others had finished assessing. He was going to appraise the farm quickly, make her an offer quickly, and apply whatever pressure he could apply to move her toward accepting it quickly. She was going to have to be faster than he expected. She closed her eyes and let herself sleep. She was up before the light the next morning. She heated water on the camp stove for instant coffee, ate crackers and peanut butter standing in the kitchen doorway, and gave Pearl his breakfast in the aluminum bowl she had brought from home. Then she put on her coat and her boots and her garden gloves and she went to the barn. The morning was cold and clear, the sky a deep pale blue above the bare oaks at the east edge of the property. Her breath moved in front of her in small clouds. The fields on either side of the property lay flat and quiet under a thin frost, and somewhere in the tree line at the back of the land a woodpecker was methodically working on something. She stood outside the barn for a moment listening to it, then went in. She began at the north wall, at the left edge of the timber platform Harold's letter had described, and she swept. This was the first necessary thing, not to rush toward the ring bolt, but to clear the surface of the platform board by board, removing the decades of accumulated material that lay on top of them. Dust and chaff and the dry remains of things that had nested here in the years of vacancy. She worked slowly, sweeping from north wall outward in careful strokes, keeping the debris consolidated so she could see the board surface clearly as she went. The boards were wide plank oak, old growth, their surfaces worn smooth by whatever loads had rested on them over the working life of this barn. They were heavy. She tested one by pressing down firmly at its edge and felt the solidity of dense old timber. Each board ran the full width of the platform, roughly 8 feet, and they were fitted together with a precision that suggested serious craftsmanship. No gaps, no warping, the joints still tight despite the years. She was 3 boards in from the left edge when she found it. She almost missed it. The ring bolt was small iron, perhaps 1.5 inches in diameter, set flush into the surface of the board in a recess that was nearly invisible under the accumulated grime. It would have looked like a knot or a damage mark to anyone who was not looking for it specifically. She would not have seen it at all if she had not been sweeping slowly and carefully, and if the morning light through the barn doors had not caught the iron at exactly the angle it caught, throwing a faint shadow along the recess edge. She crouched down and looked at it carefully. Then she put her finger into the ring and pulled. The ring lifted stiffly from its recess, old iron grinding against old iron, and held. She pulled more firmly and it swung upward on its hinge until it stood perpendicular to the board surface. She was holding the pull ring of a trapdoor. Elna sat back on her heels and breathed. Pearl came and put his nose near the ring and sniffed with professional seriousness. She did not open it yet. This was not impatience being managed, it was something more deliberate. She wanted to understand what she had before she disturbed it. She wanted to look at it for a moment and let it be real. Harold had driven out here 3 times and not found this. His father Edmund had sealed it and carried the knowledge of it alone for the rest of his life. Harold's grandfather, she did not yet know his name, had built the room beneath this floor during years he had called hard, and had used it when he needed to, and had sealed it when things improved. Whatever was down there had been sealed for a very long time. She needed tools before she opened it. She needed a proper flashlight, not just the camp lantern. She needed someone who knew what they were doing with old timber, because she was not certain the floor structure around the trapdoor was sound enough to stand on without knowing what lay beneath. She needed help. Harold had said so in his letter, and she was not going to dismiss that simply because asking for help had never come easily to her. She covered the ring bolt carefully with a clean cloth from her pocket, stood, and walked back to the farmhouse. The town of Marsden, Indiana was 11 miles north on the county road. She knew it moderately well from the early years of her marriage when she and Harold had come out to the area occasionally to visit Edmund before he died. It was the kind of small town that had organized itself around agriculture and continued to do so even as the farms around it consolidated and the economics changed. Hardware store, feed store, diner, a small branch bank, a post office that was also a UPS shipping point, a church at each of the 4 main intersections. The kind of place where the same families had run the same businesses for 2 and 3 generations, and where knowing a person's surname told you most of what you needed to know about their context. The woman at the hardware store counter was the same woman who had helped her the previous afternoon, a sturdy and direct person of about 60 named Bev, who had the quality of someone who has worked with the public long enough to quickly categorize what kind of help each person actually needs, as opposed to the kind they say they need. Elna explained her situation plainly. She said she had inherited the Calloway farm on Barrow Creek Road and was assessing its condition. She said she needed the name of a structural person, someone who knew old farm buildings and could help her evaluate what she was working with safely before she began any further exploration. Bev looked at her for a moment. "You're Harold Calloway's wife," she said. "I was," Elna said. Bev nodded, and the nod carried something not pity, but acknowledgement. "I heard," she said simply. "I'm sorry." She wrote a name and phone number on a hardware store receipt form and slid it across the counter. Thomas Brecht. He's semi-retired, but he did structural work on half the farm buildings in this county over 40 years. He'll know what you're dealing with before he's been inside 5 minutes. Tell him Bev sent you. Thomas Brecht was 71, a solid man with large, careful hands and the particular stillness of someone who has learned that the most important information about a building is what it shows you when you are quiet enough to let it. He came out the following morning, arriving in a truck with a bed full of tools he selected from with the unhurried precision of long expertise. He walked the perimeter of the farmhouse first without comment, then went inside and moved through every room on the ground floor and up the staircase and through the upper rooms that were accessible, pressing walls, testing floors, examining the chimney from inside the firebox with a flashlight, and still without comment. He came out and stood in the yard and looked at the structure for another minute. "West half of the house is sound," he said finally. "Foundation's solid, framing's holding. You'll need the roof addressed before next winter, but it's not urgent today. East side had some water intrusion through the broken windows. I'd want to look at those floor joists more carefully before putting weight on them. Chimney's structurally fine, you can use the fireplace." He paused. "The barn is in better shape than the house, which is unusual. Built by someone who knew what they were doing." He looked at her directly. "What are you planning to do with it?" "I'm planning to stay," Elna said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, as if she had given the right answer. He came back the next day with a truck bed full of lumber and a thermos of coffee and began with the roof. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She had not told Thomas about the trapdoor yet. She had thought carefully about who needed to know what and in what order, and she had concluded that she needed to understand the structural situation above the room before she understood the room itself. If the platform floor was compromised, opening the trapdoor carelessly could damage whatever was below. She had waited this long, she could wait a few more days. She also had 2 phone calls to manage. Dennis called on the 3rd day. His opening tone was the managed warmth tone she had catalogued from years of holiday dinners, not unkind, but purposeful, moving toward something specific. He said he hoped she was comfortable. He said he assumed she must be staying somewhere in Marsden rather than at the farm itself, because of course the farmhouse wasn't livable. She said she was at the farm. A pause. He said he wanted to have a conversation about the practical path forward, for everyone's sake. He said he and Renata had connected with a commercial agricultural appraiser and that preliminary indications on the farm property suggested a market value in the range of $200,000 to $240,000, given the land and the derelict structures. He said that if Elna wanted to avoid the complications of managing a property in that condition at her age, they would be willing to take it off her hands at the appraised rate. He framed this as a generosity. Elna thanked him and said she would be in touch. She did not say when. Renata called the following day. Renata's approach was different from Dennis's softer, drawing on the language of family feeling in a way that Dennis's purely transactional approach did not. She talked about how much Harold had loved the farm as a place of memory, and how she knew Elna had that same love for it, and how sometimes the most loving thing you could do for a place that held your heart was to let it go cleanly rather than watching it decline further. She used the phrase Harold would have wanted several times in contexts that Elna did not find compelling but listened to politely. When Renata finished, Elna said, "Renata, I think Harold left me the farm because he believed I would know what to do with it. I intend to find out if he was right." She said goodbye and hung up. Tomas finished the critical roof work by the end of the first week and moved on to the barn. He spent 2 days on the barn exterior reinforcing the failing hinge on the crooked door, checking the wall framing at the base where ground moisture had worked at the old timber. It was on the second day in the barn, while Tomas was working along the south wall, that Elna decided it was time. She had spent the evenings in the farmhouse. The fireplace was working now. The west side rooms were livable with the camp cot and the lantern and the camp stove in the kitchen corner. She had cleared and cleaned, reading everything she had been able to find about the history of the Calloway family property. Richard Chalk had sent her the complete property records electronically at her request. She had the land survey going back to the original Garland County plat registration of 1891, when Harold's great-grandfather Thomas Edmund Calloway had filed the deed on 41 acres of Indiana bottomland. She had the subsequent transfer records: Thomas to his son Edmund Sr. in 1929, Edmund Sr. to Edmund Jr. in 1952, Edmund Jr. to Harold in 1989 following the elder Edmund's death. She had also found, in a cardboard box in the upstairs bedroom that still contained the remnants of Edmund's occupation, a bundle of letters tied with kitchen twine. Farm correspondence, mostly equipment suppliers, seed catalogs, a few legal letters from the 1940s regarding a boundary dispute with the adjacent property that had been resolved quietly. But among them, 3 letters from Edmund Sr., Harold's grandfather, written in the winter of 1933, the heart of the Depression years, addressed to his wife Margaret, who was apparently staying with her sister in Indianapolis while Edmund Sr. managed the farm alone. Edmund Sr.'s handwriting was a farmer's handwriting, unpracticed and effortful but entirely legible. The first letter talked about the cold and the state of the livestock and the fact that 2 neighboring farms had been foreclosed by the bank that month. Their families moved out in a way Edmund wrote about with restrained fury that came through despite the plain language. The second letter mentioned that he had taken a precaution, his word, regarding the family's long-term security. He wrote that he did not want to put details in a letter but that Margaret should know there was a place on the property that would hold certain things safe until they were needed, and that he would show her when she returned. The third letter, written 3 weeks later, said only, "It is done. The room is finished. It will hold. Come home when you can." Elna had read these 3 letters sitting by the farmhouse fireplace with Pearl at her feet, and she had understood what she was reading with the sudden clarity of something that had been just out of focus suddenly sharpening. Edmund Sr. had built the room in 1933. The Depression. Banks failing across the county, neighbors losing their land to foreclosure. A practical man making a practical decision about what a family kept when institutions could not be trusted to hold up for them. She went to Tomas in the barn and told him what Harold's letter had described. She showed it to him. She had decided he had earned the trust of knowing, and the practical reality was that she needed his assessment of the platform floor's structural integrity before she moved any of those boards. Tomas read the letter carefully. He refolded it and handed it back to her. Then he walked to the north wall and crouched beside the timber platform and ran his hands along the board edges and looked at the joints the way she had watched him look at the farmhouse framing, quietly, letting the structure tell him things. He pressed down at several points. He pulled a short pry bar from his belt and worked it gently into a board joint and levered slightly. "Floor structure is sound," he said. "Old-growth oak this thick doesn't go soft easily." He stood and looked at her. "You want to go in now?" "Yes," Elna said. They moved the boards carefully, Tomas taking the left side and Elna the right, lifting each one by its edges and setting it flat against the north wall to preserve them intact. The platform surface cleared slowly, board by board, until the trapdoor was fully exposed, a section of framing roughly 4 feet by 5, fitted with the iron ring bolt and hinged on the far side with iron strap hinges that were dark with age but still solid. Tomas checked the hinge bolts and the frame. "Everything holding," he said. He took hold of the ring bolt and looked at Elna once. She nodded. He pulled. The door was heavy, framed in the same oak as the platform boards, its underside showing planking fitted with the same tight joinery she had seen on the surface. It resisted, the seal of decades releasing slowly with a dry groan that resonated in the silent barn, and then it came up, swinging on its hinges until it stood perpendicular, and the space beneath was open. The smell was the first thing. Dry and close and older than anything she had smelled in the farmhouse. Not unpleasant. The smell of sealed space, of air that had not moved in a very long time, of old wood and something else beneath it that she would identify later as cedar and mineral, the specific combination of materials that had been packed carefully against moisture and time. Tomas shone his flashlight down into the opening. A staircase led down timber, fitted into the earth walls of the room below with iron brackets, perhaps 8 steps to a floor of packed clay. The room itself was roughly 12 feet by 15, its walls formed from fieldstone laid in careful courses, its ceiling the underside of the barn floor with heavy timber supports running across it. Everything solid. Everything intentional. Everything built by a man who was planning for the long term. And along every wall, floor to ceiling in the stone courses that formed the shelving Edmund Sr. had built into the room's construction, were objects wrapped in canvas and an oilcloth and in the kind of heavy waxed paper that does not exist anymore, tied with cord that had gone stiff and brown with decades but held. Elna stood at the edge of the opening and looked down at what Harold's grandfather had sealed in 1933 and what Harold's father had never reopened and what Harold had been unable to find and what Harold had left to her to open in his place. She looked at all of it, the carefully wrapped shapes on the stone shelves, the clay floor unmarked by any other visitor, the staircase waiting. Then she descended. The clay floor was firm and cold beneath her boots. The air was still and dry and the smell was stronger here, cedar and mineral, and beneath it something metallic she could not yet place. She brought her flashlight up and turned slowly, taking the full measure of the room before touching anything. The shelving ran 3 walls north, east, and west. The south wall held the staircase and above it a timber beam that anchored the ceiling structure. On the north wall the shelving was built in 3 tiers, each roughly 18 inches deep, and every tier was occupied. On the east and west walls the shelving ran in 2 tiers, similarly occupied. The objects on them were varied in size and shape, some flat and stacked, some bulky and rounded, some clearly boxes or cases, some single objects wrapped individually. All of it carefully, deliberately arranged. All of it sealed. She picked up the nearest object from the lowest shelf of the north wall. Canvas wrapping, tied with cord. She worked the cord loose, it came apart in her hands, dried through and peeled back the canvas. It was a glass jar. Old, hand-blown, dark green, its lid sealed with wax that had dried to a hard amber shell. Inside the jar, behind the dark glass, she could see the settled gleam of something that did not move the way liquid moves. She picked up another. This one an oilcloth, tied more tightly, heavier in her hands than the first. She unwrapped it to find a tin box with a clasp lock, its exterior dark with age but intact. She worked the clasp and lifted the lid. Coins. American gold coins, stacked in precise columns inside the tin, each column separated from the next by a strip of the same waxed paper that wrapped everything else in the room. The coins were small and dull and unambiguous. She lifted one carefully and brought her flashlight to it. The eagle was unmistakable. The date stamped beneath it read 1928. Elna held the coin in her palm in the cold dry air of the sealed room beneath her husband's family's barn and understood several things at once. She understood what Edmund Sr. had meant when he wrote that he had taken a precaution. She understood why Edmund Jr. had sealed the room back when things improved and never found the right way to account for it. She understood why Harold had felt the weight of this for years without being able to resolve it. And she understood, with a certainty that settled over her as completely as the silence of the sealed room, that Dennis and Renata Calloway had not simply overlooked the farm in their father's estate. They had overlooked everything. She sat down carefully on the lowest stair, the coin still in her palm, Pearl's face visible at the edge of the trapdoor above her, looking down with his ancient patient eyes, and she allowed herself exactly 4 minutes. Then she stood up. She put the coin back in the tin, closed the lid carefully, rewrapped it in the oilcloth. She climbed back up the stairs and stood in the barn in the November light and looked at Tomas, who had waited at the edge of the opening without following her down, giving her the room to enter first, which she had not asked for but which was exactly right. "She needs an expert," Tomas said. "Not a question." "Several," Elna said. "And an attorney." She went to find her phone. Richard Chalk drove out to the farm the following morning. She had called him the evening before, not from panic, not from urgency of the dramatic kind, but from the practical recognition that what she had found beneath the barn floor required legal clarity before it required anything else. Chalk arrived at 9 in a sensible sedan, wearing his coat and carrying his leather briefcase, and he stood at the edge of the trapdoor opening for a long moment before descending the stairs behind her. He did not speak while he looked at the shelves. He moved his flashlight slowly along the wrapped contents the way a reader moves along the spines of books in a library deliberately, taking inventory. When he came back up he stood in the barn and cleaned his glasses and put them back on. "Whatever is down there," he said carefully, "was sealed prior to your ownership, prior to Edmund Calloway's death, and prior to Harold's ownership of the property. The contents of the room were conveyed to you as part of the property deed under the language all structures, all outbuildings, all contents therein." He paused. "That language is as broad as property language gets. I drafted it that way deliberately because Harold asked me to draft it that way deliberately." Elna looked at him. He knew. Chalk met her eyes. "He never told me specifically what was in the barn. But he asked me 3 times over the years to review the deed language and confirm that all contents of the property known and unknown would transfer cleanly to you with the property itself. He was a careful man. He wanted to be certain." She thought about Harold reviewing the deed language 3 times. She thought about him driving out here 3 times to look for the room himself and not finding the ring bolt under the dust of the platform boards. He had been trying to do both things at once, secure the legal protection and find the physical thing, and had run out of time before he could complete either. He had handed her the letter instead, and trusted her with the rest of it, because he had always trusted her with the things that mattered most. She needed an appraiser, Chalk said. A qualified one, someone with credentials that would hold up to any subsequent legal challenge. He said he knew a firm in Indianapolis that handled estate and discovery appraisals with the kind of institutional rigor that courts found credible. He would make the call himself. He made it from the farmhouse kitchen while Elna heated water for coffee on the camp stove and Pearl investigated the corners of the room with the thorough method of a dog who has lived long enough to do everything at the pace he finds appropriate. The appraisal firm was called Hartwell and Associates. The lead appraiser who drove out 4 days later was a woman named Dr. Miriam Voss, perhaps 60 years old, compact and precise in a way that reminded Elna of certain surgeons she had known in her years of hospital volunteer work, people who had made an absolute discipline of seeing clearly what was in front of them without the interference of what they hoped to see. She brought a second appraiser with her, a younger man named Paul Decker who specialized in numismatics and handled the coin inventory with the reverent efficiency of someone for whom this was both profession and calling. They spent 2 full days in the room beneath the barn. Elna did not go down during the appraisal. She had decided this instinctively and held to it. The room had been hers to enter first and to sit in alone with her flashlight and Harold's letter and the weight of what she had found, and that experience was complete and she held it as something private. What happened now was the formal process, the documentation, the authentication, the establishment of provable value. She let the professionals do what they were trained to do, and she stayed in the farmhouse and worked. She cleaned the east side rooms carefully, testing every floorboard before committing weight, assessing the water damage Tomas had flagged. She swept the upstairs. She carried trash out in bags. She worked because work was what she knew how to do when she was holding something large and needed to give her hands a task while her mind processed it. Tomas came and went during those 2 days, working on the barn exterior, present without being intrusive. On the first evening he left a casserole dish on the farmhouse porch without knocking, which she found when she came out for air at dusk. She brought it inside and ate by the fireplace with Pearl and did not try to put language to what she was feeling, because some things do not benefit from language while they are still in motion. On the third day, Dr. Voss asked to meet with her at the kitchen table. She laid out her documentation in the careful order of a person who has been working toward a specific presentation. She had a laptop open with photographs, a printed inventory form, and a lined notebook full of the kind of notes that represent the compressed result of 2 days of expert engagement with something extraordinary. She began with the coins. The collection, she said, consisted of 412 individual pieces. American gold coinage primarily, spanning from 1850 through 1932, the year before the room was sealed. The collection included standard circulated pieces of significant age, but also, and here her professional composure carried the weight of something genuinely remarkable, 47 pieces that Paul Decker had identified as rare dates and mint mark combinations. Including, she said, setting a photograph on the table, 3 coins from the 1927 D series and a single 1933 St. Gaudens double eagle, one of the most sought-after coins in American numismatics, legal to own under current regulations for privately held examples that predated government recall. Elna looked at the photograph of the double eagle. It was a beautiful coin, the figure of liberty striding forward on one face, the eagle on the other, the detail still sharp despite its age. The glass jars along the north wall, Dr. Voss continued, contained gold dust and small nuggets. 19 jars in total. The material had been assayed by weight and purity using portable equipment. The total gold content across all 19 jars came to approximately 42 troy ounces of high-purity placer gold, the kind accumulated by a working prospector rather than purchased through commercial channels. She had no direct evidence of how Edmund Sr. had acquired it, but the grain size and composition were consistent with Appalachian or Great Lakes region placer deposits. The waxed paper wrapping on the oilcloth bundles along the east and west walls had contained, in addition to the coin tins, 11 pieces of American folk art silversmithing, ladles, spoons, a cream pitcher, and a set of 6 small cups, all dating to the mid-19th century and crafted in the distinctive style of a regional tradition that had produced very few surviving complete sets in this condition. There were also 6 paintings on board, small format, in oil, consistent with the work of itinerant portraitists who traveled the Indiana and Ohio rural circuits in the 1860s through 1880s. 2 of the 6 she was sending photographs to a specialist at the Indiana State Museum for further review. She opened her notebook to the summary page and turned it toward Elna. My preliminary range for the complete collection, she said, is between $1.4 and $1.9 million. The coin collection represents the majority of that value, with the numismatic rarities driving the upper estimate significantly. The placer gold is priced at current spot plus provenance premium. The silver folk art and the paintings are more dependent on specialist auction outcomes, but I am conservative in my estimates. She looked at Elna steadily. I want you to have a realistic number rather than an exciting one. The realistic number is still significant. Elna looked at the figures on the notebook page for a long moment. She thought about Dennis's appraisal of the farm. $200,000 to $240,000. She thought about the lock on the front door on the day of Harold's funeral. She looked at Dr. Voss and said, "How long will the full appraisal take?" 6 to 8 weeks for the specialist reviews, Dr. Voss said. The numismatics can be moved faster if needed. The paintings will take the longest to authenticate fully. Elna thanked her. She thanked Paul Decker. She walked them both to their car and stood in the November yard and watched them drive out the gravel road toward the county highway, and then she stood in the cold quiet for a moment with the fields on all sides and the woodpecker working again somewhere in the east tree line, the same one she had been hearing since the first morning, reliable and unhurried in its business. She went inside and called Richard Chalk. She told him the preliminary figures. He was silent for a moment on the other end of the line, not the silence of surprise, because Chalk was not a man given to visible surprise, but the silence of a professional absorbing significant information and ordering his response to it. He said, "Dennis has filed a motion contesting the will's property distribution. It came through this morning. He's asserting that the farm property was undervalued in the estate assessment and that the distribution was therefore inequitable. He's also raising a question of undue influence in the will's drafting, citing Elna's position as Harold's surviving spouse and primary caregiver in his final year." Elna was quiet. "He waited 12 days after the funeral," she said. "He waited until he thought the motion would catch you before you'd had time to organize," Chalk said. He did not say this with particular heat. He said it as a factual assessment. He also said, "He does not know what's in the barn." "No," Elna said. "He doesn't." There was a pause that carried the weight of professional satisfaction restrained by professional decorum. "I'll prepare the response," Chalk said. "Don't contact Dennis or Renata directly until I advise you to." She did not. The weeks that followed were the quietest and most productive of Elna's recent memory. She worked on the farmhouse every day with Tomas, who had transitioned from contracted work to something less formally defined, showing up each morning, assessing what needed to be done, doing it with the quiet competence of a man who had found a project that interested him and saw no reason to rush its completion. The east side rooms were stabilized and dried out. The kitchen was made genuinely functional, not modern, not renovated, but working, with the old cast iron range cleaned and tested and the water restored through the well pump that Tomas coaxed back into operation with new seals and a replacement pressure tank. Hot water came back on a Tuesday morning in December and she stood at the kitchen sink with her hands under it for a full minute, feeling it run. The farmhouse began to feel like something. Not merely a structure but a place, the specific quality that buildings develop when someone is living in them intentionally, when the rooms are used rather than preserved, when the windows get opened and the fireplace gets lit and the smell of cooking comes out of the kitchen. Tomas said once, loading tools into his truck at the end of a day, that he had driven past this place every couple of years for 30 years and always thought it was a shame. She understood what he meant. She had begun, in the evenings, to read more of Edmund Sr.'s letters and the additional papers she had found in the second box in the upstairs bedroom, a box she had not opened until the appraisal was underway because she had wanted to understand what she had found before she looked for more context around it. The second box contained a farm ledger from the 1920s and early 1930s, Edmund Sr.'s handwriting throughout, recording the business of the farm in the precise, economical language of a man who understood that the record itself was a form of protection. The ledger told a story she recognized, in the way you recognize things you did not personally experience but whose shape is familiar from the accumulated history of people like the one who created it. Edmund Sr. had been a prosperous farmer by the modest standards of rural Indiana in the 1920s. He had worked his land well, diversified his crops carefully, maintained his equipment without debt when he could manage it. The early ledger pages showed steady, careful accumulation, not wealth exactly, but security, the kind that comes from consistent right decisions made over years. Then the Depression pages began and the ledger's tone shifted. Not in language. Edmund Sr.'s handwriting stayed as precise as ever, but in what was being recorded. Equipment sold. Livestock reduced. Accounts at the Marsden Branch Bank marked with a notation she did not immediately understand until she found a letter tucked between two ledger pages from 1931, addressed to Edmund from the bank manager, informing him that the bank would be limiting withdrawals effective immediately due to liquidity constraints. The same bank, she understood, that had foreclosed on two of his neighbors the following year. Edmund Sr. had watched the institution he trusted to hold what he had built begin to fail, and he had made a decision. He had taken what he could out of the system that was failing and put it somewhere the system could not reach. He had built a room in his barn floor and he had filled it with gold and silver and the portable, durable, universally valued things that do not require a functioning institution to retain their worth, and he had sealed it and said nothing about it to anyone except his wife Margaret in letters carefully worded not to specify what or where, and he had gone on farming and gone on living and never touched what was below the barn floor again because things had improved enough that he did not need 2. And then Edmund Sr. had died in 1952 and told his son Edmund Jr. about the room the night before he died, the way people tell their children the things they have been carrying too long at the last possible moment, and Edmund Jr. had kept it the same way his father had kept it sealed, unresolved, passed forward, and he had died in 1987 and told Harold the same way, the night before the end, and Harold had carried it for 35 years and driven out 3 times to try to find the ring bolt in the platform boards and been unable to, and had finally written the letter and trusted her with what he had never managed to close. For generations of careful, quiet accumulation. 1 room. 1 iron ring bolt set flush in old oak planking. Waiting. She sat with that for a long time in the evenings, by the fireplace with Pearl warm against her side, and she thought about what it meant to inherit not just a thing but a patience, the patience of people who sealed what they valued and trusted that the right time to open it would eventually arrive. The hearing was scheduled for the 2nd week of January at the Garland County Courthouse in Marsden. Chalk had filed a comprehensive response to Dennis's motion that included Harold's complete documented instructions for the will's drafting, 3 years of notarized amendments that Harold had made with full recorded legal clarity, and an affidavit from the attending physician who had overseen Harold's care in his final year and who had documented Harold's cognitive clarity and the complete absence of any indication of susceptibility to influence throughout the period in question. Chalk had also, and he told Elna this the evening before the hearing with the care of someone preparing her for something significant, formally disclosed the existence and preliminary appraised value of the barn room's contents to the court as a matter of material transparency. This was required, he said. The contents were now part of the estate record. Dennis and Renata would learn the figure in the courtroom. Elna understood. She had known this moment was coming. She had spent the week since the appraisal preparing herself for it, not with strategy but with the same quiet she had brought to everything since the day of the funeral, the 4-minute rule applied over and over, feeling what needed to be felt and then setting it aside and going back to work. Dennis and Renata arrived at the courthouse together, as they had at the will reading, with the same 2 attorneys from the firm in Indianapolis. Dennis was in a dark coat over a suit. Renata wore gray. Their attorneys arranged their materials at their table with the efficient preparation of people who believe they are holding the better hand. The judge assigned to the matter was a man named Honorable James Okafor, 57 years old, with the precise, efficient manner of someone who moves through his docket with intention and has no patience for filings that consume court resources without substantive basis. He reviewed the preliminary documents before the session opened and had already read the response Chalk had filed. Chalk presented first, as he always did, methodically, without performance, the way a craftsman works who has made the same thing so many times that the quality is entirely in the preparation rather than the execution. He submitted Harold's documented instructions, the physician's affidavit, the 3 years of notarized will amendments. He submitted the property deed with its explicit all-contents language and the record of Harold's 3 specific requests to review and confirm that language. He submitted a brief statement from Thomas Brecht, who had witnessed the trapdoor discovery and could attest to the undisturbed sealed condition of the room, establishing that the contents had not been placed there during Elna's ownership. Then he submitted Dr. Voss's preliminary appraisal. It was at the submission of this document that Dennis Calloway's posture changed. It was not a dramatic change. It was the small, specific adjustment a person makes when they receive information that is significantly different from what they were expecting, when the room they believed they understood reveals a dimension they had not accounted for. His attorney leaned toward him and said something quietly. Dennis's jaw tightened. The opposing attorneys argued their motion: undue influence, inequitable distribution, the assertion that the farm's value had been misrepresented in the estate settlement. The arguments were constructed unlawyerly and completely insufficient in the face of the documentation Chalk had assembled. Judge Okafor listened to all of it with the neutral attention of a man who has heard many arguments and has learned to wait for the moment when the shape of a thing becomes clear. He asked Dennis's lead attorney one question: can you provide any documentary evidence that Harold Calloway's testamentary decisions were influenced by any party other than himself? The attorney said they had circumstantial indication. Judge Okafor said, I asked for documentary evidence. The attorney acknowledged there was none. Okafor denied the motion in full. He said the language of the will was unambiguous and the documented intent of the testator was clear. He said the claim of undue influence was without evidentiary support. He looked at both attorneys and said that the court's time was a shared and finite resource and that claims filed without substantive evidentiary basis had consequences for courts that had no shortage of cases requiring their attention. His tone said the rest of it. The gavel came down. Elna sat beside Chalk for a moment after the room began to move around them. She heard Renata's voice across the room, saying something to one of the attorneys in a low, tight voice. She heard Dennis say nothing at all. Outside the courthouse, the January air was sharp and bright, the kind of cold that clarifies everything it touches. Chalk walked with her to the parking lot with the unhurried pace of a man who has finished the work he came to do. He shook her hand at her car and said, Harold was right about you. She drove back to Barrow Creek Road. Dennis called 3 days later. She had expected this, not the call itself but the fact that it would come without attorneys, in his own voice, because Dennis Calloway was ultimately a businessman and businessmen eventually had the conversation that the legal process had made unavoidable. His opening was different from any he had used before. No managed warmth. No transactional efficiency. Just his actual voice, which she heard now without the performance around it for what she believed might be the first time. He said, I didn't know. She believed him. Not because it exonerated him the locks, the quick appraisal, the motion filed 12 days after the funeral, but because it was true, and she had always been more interested in true things than in comfortable ones. I know, she said. He was quiet for a moment. He said, I owe you an apology for how this was handled. Not for the legal process. He was honest enough not to apologize for that. But for the locks. That was, he stopped. That was wrong. It was, Elna said simply. She did not fill the silence that followed with reassurance. She let it be what it was. After a moment he said, I hope you'll do something meaningful with the farm. And she heard in his voice that he meant it, or meant the part of it that was possible for him to mean, which was not everything but was something. She said, I intend to. The final authentication was completed in March. The complete appraisal came in at $1.7 million. The 1933 Double Eagle alone, authenticated by 2 independent numismatic specialists and confirmed as a privately held example predating the government recall, accounted for a significant portion of the upper range value. Paul Decker handled the coin sale through a specialized numismatic auction house in Chicago, and the process took 4 months, but the results across every lot met or exceeded the estimates. The placer gold was sold to a precious metals dealer through Dr. Voss's network. The folk silver went to a private collector in Cincinnati who had been assembling a regional craftwork collection for 20 years. The 2 paintings that the Indiana State Museum specialist confirmed were works of documented regional portraitists sold through a fine art auction in Indianapolis. The other 4 went to private buyers Paul Decker identified through the numismatic auction network. Elna received the proceeds in stages as each category of sale cleared. She sat at the kitchen table of the farmhouse after each wire transfer confirmation and looked at the figure for a moment and then went back to whatever she had been doing, because the money was not the point, and she had understood this from the evening she sat in the barn room with the gold coin in her palm and gave herself 4 minutes. The point was what Harold had known about her. The point was what Edmund Sr. had built in 1933 and sealed and trusted to survive. The point was the letter in Harold's careful engineer's handwriting that said she was the only person he had ever known who looked at broken things and saw what they still had in them. She used the proceeds in the order that mattered most to her. She cleared the farm property's back taxes and registered it cleanly in her name with all encumbrances removed. She commissioned Tomas to lead a full structural restoration of the farmhouse, not a modernization, but a restoration, everything returned to the quality it had been built to, using materials consistent with the original construction where they could be sourced and honest equivalents where they could not. The old cast iron range was fully restored by the same specialist in Knoxville who had heard about the farmhouse from Tomas through the network of people who cared about such things. The floors throughout the west half were refinished by hand. The east side floors were replaced in kind, same width plank, same species, fitted to match. The porch was rebuilt from the foundation up, its proportions identical to the original, its boards new but its joinery done by hand the way the original had been done. The barn she restored to working order. She bought 4 sheep from a farm in the next county, because Tomas told her the barn was built for livestock and a barn without livestock was a building pretending to be something it wasn't, and she had found she agreed with him. She established a small fund at the Marsden Branch Bank, the same bank that Edmund Sr.'s generation had watched fail, now absorbed into a larger institution and restored to function, designated for operating costs on the farm and a portion she set aside specifically for the kind of thing she had needed when she arrived at Barrow Creek Road in November with a camp cot and a 12-year-old beagle and $200 worth of hardware supplies and the quiet determination not to be moved. She had needed someone like Tomas who showed up without being asked and did the thing that needed doing. She funded a small community assistance program through Chalk's office, structured simply, without bureaucracy, that provided emergency farm stabilization help to elderly property owners in Garland County who were facing loss of land through tax delinquency or deferred maintenance they could no longer manage alone. It was not large. It did not need to be large to be real. She planted a kitchen garden along the south wall of the farmhouse in April, raised beds built from reclaimed lumber from the barn's original fallen sections that Tomas had set aside specifically when she mentioned wanting to plant something. Herbs first, then vegetables, then along the east end of the garden a row of daylilies she had brought from cuttings taken from the house on Delaware Road before it was sold. Her own garden, her own plants, moved to the soil where she had decided to stay. Renata came in May. She called first, which Elna appreciated, and she came alone, without attorneys, without Gregory Pierce, which Elna appreciated more. She stood in the yard and looked at the farmhouse for a long time before she said anything. Then she said it was beautiful, and Elna heard in her voice that she was seeing something she had not expected and was having a feeling about it she had not prepared for. Elna showed her through the house, and she showed her the barn, and she showed her the room, the trapdoor propped open, the platform boards stacked neatly against the north wall, the stone shelving now empty and clean, the cedar and mineral smell still faintly present in the sealed air. Renata stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked at the empty shelves without speaking for a moment. Then she said, "He built all of this." And Elna said, "His grandfather built it. During the Depression. He didn't trust the bank." Renata said, "He was right not to." They had tea in the kitchen afterward, which was warm from the cast iron range, and Pearl slept in the corner in the specific way of very old dogs who have decided that a place has earned their complete relaxation. Renata asked about the sheep, which she had seen in the barn, and Elna told her about the wool she was planning to learn to spin, which was something she had read about in Edmund Sr.'s ledger, a notation in 1924 about Margaret's spinning wheel, which had been in the house somewhere and which Elna had not yet found but intended to. Renata looked at her across the kitchen table with an expression that was not the polite surface Elna had catalogued from 12 years of holidays. It was something more honest than that, and more tired, and more real. She said, "I think my father knew exactly what he was doing when he left it to you." Elna said, "I think so too." She stood on the restored porch on a May evening, the fields around her green from the spring rain, Pearl at her feet in the particular way he had taken to sitting with her in the evenings, not pressed against her anymore, just near, the way very old dogs conserve their warmth but do not want to be apart. The light over the Indiana fields at that hour was long and gold and deeply unhurried, the kind of light that belongs to flat country in late spring, the kind that does not announce itself but simply arrives and stays until the last moment before dark. She held Harold's letter. She had taken to carrying it in her coat pocket again, not because she needed to read it, she knew it by heart now, every word, but because it was the weight of it she wanted. The specific gravity of what he had written and what he had trusted her to find. She thought about Edmund Sr. building the room in 1933 with a farmer's hands and a farmer's practicality and the knowledge that institutions fail and that what you build with your own effort deserves to be in a place only you can reach. She thought about Edmund Jr. sealing it again and carrying the knowledge alone. She thought about Harold driving out 3 times and not finding the ring bolt and writing the letter instead, the way an engineer solves the problem he cannot solve directly by handing the solution to the person most capable of completing it. She thought about the lock on the front door on the day of the funeral. She thought about Dennis's voice on the phone 3 days after the hearing, stripped of its performance and just honest, saying, "I didn't know." She did not feel triumph about any of it. What she felt was something quieter than triumph and more durable, the feeling of a thing that was supposed to happen having finally happened, of a long patience reaching its proper conclusion, of a door that had been sealed for a very long time standing open at last with light coming through it. Pearl made a sound. She looked down at him. He was looking out at the fields with the ancient, unhurried attention of a creature who has decided that the present moment contains everything worth looking at. She agreed with him. She stayed on the porch until the light went, and then she went inside to the warm kitchen and the fireplace Harold had told her would be safe to use, and she put on the kettle, and she sat in the room where Edmund Sr. had once sat and made his careful ledger entries by lamplight, in the house that had been sealed and forgotten and overlooked and left to fall, and that was now, completely and finally, hers. Whatever had been locked in her life was open now. Whatever had been sealed had been worth finding. And the room beneath the barn floor that no one else had thought to look for, the room built by a careful man in hard years and kept by the men who came after him and left at last to her, was empty of everything it had held and full, now, of light. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.